The Quran was plagiarized from the Bible, but not in a way we usually think of plagiarism today. And keep in mind that the Quran was written 600 years after Christ. That's roughly between 2,000 and 600 years after biblical texts. It's not a word-for-word copy, but it does borrow heavily from earlier Jewish Torah and Old Testament in the Bible and Christian traditions, the New Testament in the Bible, reworking and repackaging many of the same stories with a different theological spin. Scholars often use the term intertextuality rather than plagiarism, meaning the Quran engages with and reshapes pre-existing texts rather than simply copying them outright. And here's some example of the research that supports this idea. The first is Bible and Quran Essays in Spiritual Intertextuality. This collection of essays examines the deep connection between the Quran and the Bible, showing how many Quranic stories echo biblical ones, but with modifications. The book argues that the Quran doesn't introduce entirely new religious concept, it builds on and sometimes alters existing ones. Another one, Intellectuality in Quranic Studies, using the Bible in Quranic interpretation. And this paper discusses how the Quran content is drawn from biblical traditions and whether using the Bible to interpret the Quran makes sense. It highlights how many biblical figures and events are present in the Quran, often with slight changes to fit Islamic theory. It's all to fit their rationale, their narrative, which is to control people. It's to control people and create a religion where it's do upon do upon do, rule upon rule upon rule, to quote Isaiah. It is rules taught by men and a chain that holds them down and will eventually keep them from getting to heaven because they worship a prophet named Muhammad. Everything that was written about Muhammad was written 2 centuries after his death by people that weren't even with him. So whether he was a prophet or not, we don't know. What we do know is that he never performed any miracles. He didn't have any eyewitnesses to the things that he said and the things that he did in his life. And you can go visit his grave to this day. Another study, the Quranic's engagement with Christian and Jewish literature. This article directly addresses how the Quran interacts with earlier scriptures, sometimes retelling biblical narratives almost identically, while at other times tweaking key details. It suggests that Muhammad, or those around him, were clearly influenced by existing Jewish and Christian stories which were adopted into the Quran's own version of history. So they made it up. They made it up because they had to take the power away from the Jews and the Christians. They had to create their own power, their own narrative. Here's another one, comparing the Moses story in the Quran and the Bible. Moses is a perfect example of how the Quran borrows from biblical traditions but reinterprets them. This study looks at many parallels between the Quranic and biblical accounts of Moses, showing how much the Quran's narrative framework already existed in Jewish and Christian texts. Another one, Quran, Bible, and intertextuality. How these scriptures relate. These are essays and articles written by academia. These essays argue that the Quran's engagement with earlier scriptures is not accidental, it's deliberate. The Quran presents itself as a confirming and correcting the Bible. Yet much of its content is drawn from the same stories. And this challenges the idea that the Quran is entirely original. It's not. And so our takeaway, is the Quran plagiarized? In a modern sense, no, it's not directly copied and pasted. But in a broader sense, yes, the Quran borrows heavily from earlier religious texts, often reworking their stories rather than creating entirely new ones. Many of the prophets, teachings, and moral lessons in the Quran existed in Jewish and Christian traditions long before Islam. Rather than introducing something wholly original, The Quran acts more like a remix version of the Bible, taking existing stories and adjusting them to fit a new theological framework, which is designed to control people, to do the bidding of their religious leaders, and the effect will rob you of your joy because you think you can never be good enough, and rob you of heaven, which is the promise of Jesus.